Manhattan, New York. It was Saturday afternoon, June 23, 1973, approximately 2:47 p.m. when Frank Lucas walked into Harry Winston Jewelers on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, one of the most prestigious jewelry establishments in the world, a place where movie stars and oil barons and European royalty purchased diamonds and precious gems that cost more than most Americans would earn in their entire lifetimes. Lucas was dressed impeccably as always, wearing a custom-tailored cream-colored suit from his Italian tailor on Madison Avenue, a silk shirt in pale blue that had been handmade in London, and alligator shoes from a boutique in Paris that had cost him $3,000. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe watch worth approximately $45,000, and on his fingers were 2 gold rings set with diamonds that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through Harry Winston's elegant display windows. Lucas was accompanied by his wife Julie, a former beauty queen from Puerto Rico who'd married Lucas in 1967 and who'd become accustomed over the past 6 years to the kind of lavish lifestyle that unlimited drug money could provide. Julie wore a white dress from a designer boutique on Madison Avenue, carried a handbag from Hermes that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and moved with the confidence of a woman who knew she was beautiful and who'd learned to expect that her husband would provide her with anything she desired regardless of cost or practicality. The couple was greeted at the entrance by a sales associate named Richard Pemberton, a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s who'd worked at Harry Winston for 23 years and who'd developed an expertise in reading clients, in understanding immediately whether someone walking through the door was a serious buyer with substantial resources or merely a tourist wanting to look at jewelry they'd never be able to afford. Pemberton assessed Frank and Julie Lucas in approximately 3 seconds, noted the expensive clothes and jewelry Lucas was already wearing, observed the confident body language that suggested people accustomed to wealth rather than people pretending to belong in establishments like this, and concluded these were serious buyers who deserved his full attention and best customer service. "Good afternoon," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the carefully cultivated accent of someone who'd been trained to make wealthy clients feel comfortable and valued. "Welcome to Harry Winston. How may I assist you today?" Lucas looked at Julie, letting her take the lead in this conversation because the jewelry was for her, and because Lucas understood that women generally enjoyed the experience of selecting expensive jewelry more than men did, that allowing Julie to describe what she wanted would make the eventual purchase more meaningful than if Lucas simply pointed at something expensive and bought it without her input. "We're looking for a diamond," Julie said, her voice carrying a slight Puerto Rican accent that she'd never completely lost despite years of living in New York. "Something special, something unique, something that makes a statement. I was thinking maybe a necklace or perhaps a ring, something substantial. Not small stones, but something impressive that people notice immediately." Pemberton smiled, recognizing the code words that indicated a client with substantial budget flexibility. Something that makes a statement meant they weren't concerned about price. Something substantial meant they wanted large stones rather than delicate pieces. Something people notice immediately meant they wanted jewelry that commanded attention rather than subtle elegance. This was going to be a significant sale, possibly one of the larger transactions Pemberton would handle this quarter. "We have several pieces that might interest you," Pemberton said, gesturing toward a private viewing room off the main showroom. "If you'd like to follow me, I can show you some of our most exceptional diamonds, stones that are truly extraordinary in terms of size, clarity, and color. May I ask what price range you're considering?" Lucas answered this question, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute certainty. "Price isn't the primary concern. We want the best stone you have available, something genuinely exceptional. Show us what you've got, and if Julie likes it, we'll talk about price." Pemberton's internal estimation of this sale immediately escalated. Clients who said price wasn't the primary concern were either extremely wealthy or extremely foolish, and everything about Frank Lucas suggested wealth rather than foolishness. Pemberton led the couple into a private viewing room furnished with leather chairs, elegant lighting designed to showcase diamonds optimally, and security measures that included cameras and panic buttons in case clients turned out to be criminals planning robberies rather than legitimate buyers. Over the next 45 minutes, Pemberton showed Julie Lucas approximately dozen pieces from Harry Winston's collection. Diamond necklaces and rings and bracelets ranging in price from $30,000 to $200,000. Each piece representing exceptional quality and craftsmanship. Each stone certified and documented with extensive provenance information. Julie examined each piece carefully, tried them on, looked at herself in the mirrors that lined the viewing room walls, but nothing seemed to generate the excitement Pemberton was hoping to see, the immediate emotional reaction that indicated a client had found exactly what they wanted. Finally, after Julie had looked at everything Pemberton had initially brought out, and had expressed polite interest but not genuine enthusiasm for any of the pieces, Pemberton made a decision to show them something special, a diamond that had arrived at Harry Winston just 2 weeks earlier, and that hadn't yet been set into jewelry because the stone was so exceptional that the design team was still debating how to mount it in a way that would showcase its qualities optimally. "Mrs. Lucas," Pemberton said carefully, "I have something else I'd like to show you, though I should warn you it's quite extraordinary and quite expensive. We recently acquired a diamond that's truly exceptional, a 12-carat stone with D color and flawless clarity, which is extraordinarily rare for a diamond of this size. The stone came from South Africa, has been certified by the Gemological Institute of America, and represents the kind of diamond that becomes available perhaps once or twice per decade. We haven't finished designing the setting yet, because we wanted to create something worthy of such an exceptional stone." Lucas leaned forward in his chair, his interest obviously heightened. "How much are we talking about for a stone like that?" Pemberton hesitated, calculating how to present a price that would sound appropriately impressive without frightening away a potential buyer. For a diamond of this quality and size, properly set in platinum or gold with accent diamonds to complement the center stone, we'd be discussing an investment in the range of $100,000 to $125,000. To Pemberton's surprise and satisfaction, Lucas didn't flinch at this figure, didn't show any reaction that suggested the price was problematic or beyond his means. "Show us the stone," Lucas said simply. "Let my wife see it, and if she likes it, we can discuss the details of having it set." Pemberton excused himself, walked to Harry Winston's vault, retrieved a sealed case containing the 12-carat diamond, and returned to the viewing room where he carefully opened the case and placed the stone on a black velvet display pad under optimal lighting. The diamond was breathtaking, catching and refracting light in ways that made it seem almost alive, throwing rainbow colors across the viewing room walls, possessing that quality of absolute clarity and perfection that distinguished truly exceptional stones from merely good ones. Julie Lucas's eyes widened when she saw the diamond. Her breath caught audibly, and she reached out to touch the stone with one finger as if confirming it was real and not some optical illusion. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice almost reverent. "I've never seen anything like it. How would you set it? What would it look like as jewelry?" Pemberton pulled out sketch pads and began drawing rough designs, showing Julie various options for how the 12-carat center stone could be mounted, how accent diamonds could be arranged around it, whether it would work better as a ring or as a pendant, what style of setting would showcase the stone optimally while also being practical enough for regular wear. Julie asked questions, offered opinions about what she liked and didn't like, became increasingly animated as she visualized how this extraordinary diamond would look when she wore it. After approximately 30 minutes of discussion about design options, Julie looked at Frank and said simply, "I want it. I want this diamond. I don't care what it costs. This is the most beautiful stone I've ever seen, and I want it." Lucas smiled, the expression of a man who'd expected this outcome and who was pleased to be able to provide his wife with something that generated genuine excitement and happiness. "Then you'll have it," Lucas said. "Mr. Pemberton, let's discuss the details. We want the stone set as a ring, something elegant but substantial, platinum setting with accent diamonds, whatever design your team believes will showcase the center stone optimally. How long will it take to create the setting and complete the piece?" Pemberton calculated quickly. Considering Harry Winston's design and production schedule, the complexity of creating a setting worthy of such an exceptional stone, and the fact that clients who were willing to spend over $100,000 on jewelry typically expected expedited service, we can have the piece completed in approximately 6 weeks. We'll create several design concepts for your review. You can select the one you prefer, and then our craftsmen will construct the setting and mount the stone. For a piece of this significance, we'd typically require a 50% deposit with the balance due when the ring is completed and ready for delivery. Lucas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook, an action that made Pemberton slightly nervous because checks could bounce, and because Harry Winston preferred not to accept personal checks for purchases over $50,000 unless the client had an established relationship with the firm. But before Pemberton could explain their payment policies, Lucas said something that changed the entire dynamic of the transaction. "I'll pay cash for the full amount today. $115,000, assuming that's the final price for the stone in the setting. I'll need a receipt, of course, and documentation of the stone's certification and provenance. But I prefer to pay for significant purchases in cash rather than leaving paper trails through bank accounts." Pemberton felt his pulse quicken. Harry Winston occasionally dealt with cash transactions, but $115,000 in cash was extraordinary, raised immediate questions about where the money came from, and whether accepting it would create legal or ethical problems for the firm. Cash transactions over $10,000 required reporting to federal authorities under Bank Secrecy Act regulations that had been implemented in 1970, and Harry Winston had policies requiring management approval for large cash transactions specifically to avoid potential money laundering issues. "Mr. Lucas," Pemberton said carefully, "I appreciate your desire to pay cash, but for a transaction of this size, I'll need to consult with our manager about our procedures. Would you excuse me for a moment?" Lucas nodded, understanding what was happening, understanding that his offer to pay cash had triggered concerns about money laundering and illegal proceeds, understanding that Harry Winston was trying to determine whether accepting his money would create problems for them. This was a familiar situation for Lucas. He'd encountered it repeatedly over the past several years as his wealth had become more visible, and as legitimate businesses had started questioning whether they should accept money from someone whose source of income was obviously illegal, even if it couldn't be proven definitively. Pemberton returned after approximately 10 minutes with an older man named Charles Morrison, Harry Winston's general manager for the Fifth Avenue location, a distinguished-looking executive in his early 60s who'd spent his entire career in the luxury jewelry business and who'd developed expertise in navigating the complicated intersection between customer service and legal compliance. Morrison introduced himself to Frank and Julie Lucas, then addressed the payment issue directly. "Mr. Lucas, we certainly appreciate your business and your interest in this exceptional diamond. However, for cash transactions over $10,000, federal regulations require us to file currency transaction reports with the Treasury Department. Additionally, our firm policy requires us to verify the identity of clients making large cash purchases and to maintain documentation of the transaction. Would you be comfortable providing identification and having this transaction reported to federal authorities as regulations require?" Lucas had expected this question, had already decided how to respond. "Mr. Morrison, I'm a businessman operating several legitimate enterprises in New York. I prefer to conduct transactions in cash because it's simpler, and because I don't like having my financial activities tracked through banking systems unnecessarily. I'm happy to provide identification. I understand you need to file required reports with federal authorities, and I have no problem with documentation. My only concern is that the transaction be handled discreetly and professionally, that my wife receives the beautiful ring she's excited about, and that Harry Winston treats us with the respect that clients spending over $100,000 deserve." Morrison assessed Lucas for a moment, making calculations about risk and reward, about whether this transaction was worth potential complications, about whether Lucas's money was legal enough that accepting it wouldn't create problems for Harry Winston if law enforcement later questioned the transaction. Finally, Morrison made his decision, influenced partly by the substantial commission this sale would generate, partly by the fact that Lucas was offering to comply with all legal reporting requirements, and partly by the recognition that refusing the transaction would offend a client who might become a regular customer if this experience was positive. "We can proceed with the transaction," Morrison said. "We'll need to see identification. We'll file the required currency transaction report with federal authorities, and we'll provide you with complete documentation of the purchase, including the stone's GIA certification and detailed receipts. If you'd like to return with the cash later today or early next week, we can complete the transaction and begin work on designing and creating the setting." Lucas smiled, satisfied that his persistence had overcome Harry Winston's initial reluctance. "I have the cash with me now. It's in my car parked outside. If you'd like, I can retrieve it immediately and we can complete the transaction this afternoon." 30 minutes later, Frank Lucas returned to Harry Winston's viewing room carrying 2 leather bags containing $115,000 in cash, mostly $100 bills bundled in stacks of $10,000 each. The money was counted twice using Harry Winston's cash counting equipment, verified to be the correct amount, and transferred to the store's vault while Morrison prepared receipts and documentation. Lucas provided his driver's license for identification, signed various forms acknowledging the currency transaction report would be filed, and received detailed documentation of the diamond certification and the terms of the purchase. By 5:30 that afternoon, Frank and Julie Lucas left Harry Winston Jewelers, Julie wearing a temporary ring with a smaller diamond that Pemberton had given her as a courtesy gesture while the 12-carat stone was being set, both of them satisfied with the transaction and excited about receiving the completed ring in 6 weeks. What they didn't fully appreciate was how quickly news of this purchase would spread throughout both the legitimate business community and the criminal underworld. How many people would hear about Frank Lucas spending $115,000 cash on a diamond for his wife, and how this single transaction would trigger conversations and consequences that Lucas hadn't fully anticipated. The currency transaction report that Harry Winston filed with the Treasury Department reached federal law enforcement within 48 hours. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which had been investigating Frank Lucas since 1971, added this information to their growing file documenting Lucas's wealth and lifestyle. Federal prosecutors examining Lucas's financial activities noted that someone who'd never filed tax returns showing income sufficient to afford a $115,000 jewelry purchase was obviously earning substantial unreported income from illegal sources. The purchase became evidence of money laundering and tax evasion that would eventually be used against Lucas when federal authorities indicted him in 1975. But more immediately, the purchase triggered conversations throughout Harlem, throughout New York's criminal underworld, and among law enforcement agencies that were watching Lucas with increasing interest. The story spread rapidly through various communities, distorted and embellished with each retelling, until the actual $115,000 purchase became described as a $200,000 diamond in some versions, a $250,000 necklace in others, the kind of extravagant gesture that symbolized both Lucas's wealth and his apparent disregard for maintaining a low profile. In Harlem, the reaction to Lucas's purchase was mixed and complicated by issues of race, class, and community responsibility. Some people viewed the purchase with pride, seeing it as evidence that a black man from humble origins had achieved success on a scale that demanded recognition and respect, that Lucas had accumulated wealth that allowed him to shop at the same exclusive establishments where white millionaires shopped, that he could walk into Harry Winston and purchase whatever he wanted without anyone questioning whether he belonged there or whether he could afford it. But others viewed the purchase with anger and resentment, seeing it as evidence of how drug dealers profited from their community's suffering, while displaying their wealth ostentatiously and insensitively. Community activists pointed out that Lucas had made his fortune selling heroin that destroyed families throughout Harlem, that addicts were dying in abandoned buildings while Lucas was buying $100,000 diamonds for his wife, that the wealth Lucas displayed so prominently had been extracted from the poorest and most vulnerable people in the community he claimed to be part of. Ministers preached sermons about the moral bankruptcy of drug dealers who lived in luxury, while their customers lived in misery. Community organizers held meetings discussing how to respond to the growing drug epidemic that was devastating Harlem, while dealers like Frank Lucas accumulated fortunes. Parents whose children had become addicts or had died from overdoses saw Lucas's diamond purchase as an insult, as proof that dealers didn't care about the human cost of their business, that they viewed the community as nothing more than a market to be exploited for maximum profit. In the criminal underworld, Lucas's purchase generated different reactions. Some criminals admired the bold display of wealth, saw it as evidence of Lucas's success and power, viewed his willingness to spend extravagantly as proof that his operation was generating enormous revenues, and that Lucas himself was confident enough not to worry about attracting attention. The purchase became legendary in criminal circles, became one of those stories that people told to illustrate Lucas's wealth and his apparent invincibility. But other criminals viewed the purchase as evidence of dangerous recklessness, as proof that Lucas was becoming too confident and too visible, that he was attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement, that his extravagant lifestyle was going to trigger investigations that would eventually destroy not just Lucas himself, but potentially other criminals operating in New York. Experienced criminals understood that longevity in illegal enterprises required discretion, required maintaining a lifestyle that didn't scream drug dealer, required avoiding the kind of ostentatious displays that made law enforcement intensify their investigations. Nicky Barnes, who was building his own heroin empire in Harlem during this same period, and who would later become known as Mr. Untouchable, reportedly said that Frank Lucas's diamond purchase was the dumbest thing I ever saw a dealer do. That spending over $100,000 on jewelry while being investigated by federal authorities was practically begging to be arrested. That the purchase would be used as evidence of Lucas's illegal income and would help prosecutors convince juries that Lucas was making millions from drug distribution. Law enforcement agencies reacted to news of the purchase with satisfaction and renewed determination. Detectives who'd been investigating Lucas for years saw the purchase as confirmation that their target was making enormous profits from drug distribution, that Lucas had accumulated wealth that could only come from massive illegal operations, that building a case against him was important not just for enforcing drug laws, but for demonstrating that criminals couldn't flaunt their illegal wealth indefinitely without facing consequences. The New York Police Department's Special Investigations Unit, which had been gathering information about Lucas's operations, intensified their surveillance. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which had been building a federal case, accelerated their investigation. The Internal Revenue Service, which had been examining Lucas's tax filings and comparing them to his visible lifestyle, began preparing tax evasion charges that would eventually be filed alongside drug trafficking charges. The diamond purchase became a symbol, a data point that prosecutors would use to illustrate Lucas's illegal income, a piece of evidence that would help build the comprehensive case that would eventually destroy his empire. Julie Lucas wore her completed ring for the first time on August 4, 1973, at a party Lucas threw at his Harlem mansion to celebrate his 52nd birthday. The ring was spectacular. The 12-carat diamond set in platinum with accent diamonds arranged around it. The kind of jewelry that drew gasps and stares from everyone who saw it, that seemed almost too large and too brilliant to be real. Julie displayed the ring proudly, extending her hand so guests could examine it closely, enjoying the attention and the admiration that came from wearing something so extraordinary. But even as guests celebrated and admired the ring, some people at that party understood they were watching something dangerous, were witnessing the kind of ostentatious display that preceded falls from power, were seeing evidence that Frank Lucas had become too confident and too reckless, that his success had made him believe he was invincible, when in reality, he was becoming increasingly vulnerable to law enforcement and to rivals who would eventually take advantage of his visibility and his arrogance. One guest at that party, an older woman named Ethel Mae Johnson, who'd been friends with Bumpy Johnson and who'd known Frank Lucas since he'd first arrived in Harlem in the 1940s, reportedly pulled Lucas aside during the celebration and told him, "Frank, that ring is beautiful and your wife looks stunning wearing it. But you need to understand that every time Julie wears that ring in public, she's reminding law enforcement why they need to destroy you. She's making prosecutors more determined to convict you. She's giving them evidence they'll use to convince juries you're making millions from selling drugs. That ring is going to cost you more than $115,000. It's going to cost you your freedom." Lucas reportedly laughed off Ethel Mae's warning, told her she was worrying too much, insisted that he had lawyers and connections that would protect him from prosecution, claimed that law enforcement had been investigating him for years without being able to build a case that would result in conviction. But Ethel Mae's prediction would prove accurate. The diamond purchase became one of the pieces of evidence that federal prosecutors used when they indicted Lucas in 1975, became proof of unexplained wealth that helped establish Lucas was earning substantial illegal income, became a symbol of the extravagant lifestyle that prosecutors used to convince jurors that Lucas was a major drug trafficker who deserved lengthy prison sentences. The ring that Lucas bought for his wife in June 1973 for $115,000 would be seized by federal authorities when Lucas was arrested in January 1975. The diamond would be sold at auction as part of the process of seizing Lucas's assets, would generate approximately $80,000 that would be distributed to various law enforcement agencies and victim compensation funds, would end up owned by someone who probably never knew its history or understood that this particular diamond had played a role in bringing down one of the most successful drug dealers in New York's history. But in the summer of 1973, when Julie Lucas wore her spectacular ring to parties and events throughout New York, when people throughout Harlem were talking about Frank Lucas buying his wife a $100,000 diamond, when the purchase had become legendary in both legitimate and criminal communities, the ring represented something more complex than just expensive jewelry. It represented Lucas at the peak of his power and wealth, operating with such confidence that he didn't bother hiding his success, believing he'd built an empire that was untouchable and permanent, not yet understanding that the very displays of wealth that seemed to prove his invincibility were actually accelerating his destruction. Harlem started talking in the summer of 1973, talking about Frank Lucas and his wife's diamond ring, talking about drug dealers living in luxury while communities suffered, talking about whether success that came from selling heroin deserved admiration or condemnation, talking about the contradictions of a man who could be simultaneously a community success story and a community predator. Those conversations would continue for decades after Lucas was arrested and imprisoned, would become part of Harlem's collective memory about an era when drug money transformed the neighborhood's economy and when criminals like Frank Lucas achieved wealth and power that exceeded what most legitimate business people could accumulate. The $115,000 diamond that Frank Lucas bought his wife in June 1973 became more than jewelry. It became a symbol of an era, a marker of excess and confidence and recklessness, a beautiful object that carried within it the seeds of destruction for the empire that had purchased it. Julie Lucas wore that ring for approximately 18 months before federal agents seized it along with everything else Frank and Julie owned. But during those 18 months, the ring served its purpose, announcing to everyone who saw it that Frank Lucas had achieved a level of success that demanded recognition, that a poor kid from North Carolina had risen to heights that most people could only dream about, and that sometimes the American dream, even when achieved through illegal means, could be spectacular and brilliant and ultimately tragic, just like the 12-carat diamond that caught light and threw rainbows across rooms, while simultaneously attracting the attention of people who would eventually destroy the man who'd purchased it and the empire he'd built.